He called the police on his 9-month pregnant wife over a missing $100, and that single choice cost him everything.
Michael's certainty hardened into something heavier than logic as he hovered over the dining table, pinning his open wallet beneath his palm as if it might flee and take the truth with it. 3 crisp hundreds had become 2, and the missing bill felt like a verdict already written. The living room, tidy in the way Sarah liked it, folded blankets on the sofa's arm, a hospital bag by the door, a whiteboard on the fridge with potential baby names, turned into a stage where every object seemed to testify against her. Sarah came down carefully, one hand on the rail, the other at the small of her back. 9 months of weight changing the angle of every step, but not the steadiness of her voice. She hadn't touched his wallet, she hadn't left the house, she wouldn't take what was theirs anyway. He heard words, he trusted numbers. Linda, mug in hand and eyes sharp with the conviction of someone who equates doubt with weakness, took her place at his shoulder and spoke in the kind of calm that can slice. Respect, principles, consequences. Sarah's mouth parted, wounded more by the insinuation than the accusation, and she tried to connect the dots the way she always did. Maybe a receipt, maybe a bus stop. Maybe the ATM shorted. Maybe it's in yesterday's jeans. But each possibility bounced off the wall he'd already built. The air tightened. The clock over the mantel seemed too loud. He lifted his phone with the heaviness of a gavel and dialed. The operator's questions were blandly procedural. His answers were clipped, definitive, and the script of a man who had convinced himself there were only 2 roles available tonight, thief and protector. Sarah reached for his wrist, not to stop him, but to ask for one more heartbeat of trust. He moved his arm. Linda stepped between them with a mother's territorial posture and said, "If she's innocent, the police will prove it." The doorbell chimed, soft and indecent. 2 officers stepped inside, shoes squeaking faintly on the entry tile, eyes taking in the scene with the practiced compassion of people who see domestic storms without taking sides. One asked Michael to speak privately, the other asked Sarah to sit. She eased herself onto the sofa, breathing evenly, hands splayed over the firm roundness beneath her shirt, and answered every question with the same simple sentence, "I didn't take it." Michael described the timeline like accounting, not marriage. He said he had the bills last night. He said he noticed the shortage now. He said only 3 people were in the house. Linda added the commentary he wouldn't say out loud, that young wives can be careless, that a lesson early is kindness later. While Sarah's eyes filled, frustrated not only by disbelief, but by the sudden erasure of the years she had given him. The countless Tuesdays where trust was so normal it didn't need a name. "Are you sure you want to press charges?" one officer asked, lowering his voice, glancing at Sarah's belly, because you cannot look at the imminence of a child and not reconsider everything. Michael's jaw worked. Pride translated his uncertainty into a nod. Paperwork appeared. Statements were taken, and the room's temperature seemed to drop, though nothing had changed on the thermostat. When the cuffs came out, the officer apologized first and moved with care so nothing pressed against the baby. Sarah stood slowly, turned to Michael, and spoke not to argue, but to remind him of the life they were hours or days from meeting. "Please." He looked at the wallet instead. Neighbors, alerted by light and rumor, drifted to porches or peered from curtains, faces framing the scene like a gallery of small-town conscience. Linda said, "Tell the truth, and this ends quickly," as if truth were a lever Sarah could pull to stop the machine now humming. The officers guided her toward the door. She paused, one hand braced on the frame, and searched Michael's face for the last time that night, the way you scan a horizon for a lighthouse you're sure must be there. He gave her nothing but the angle of a man holding a position. The door clicked. The house altered. Even the furniture seemed to shift an inch away from him. Michael set the wallet on the table and tried to feel victorious. Instead, he felt the thud of a line crossed. He wandered the rooms as if he might find a better version of himself, taking refuge behind the curtains or in the nursery, with its pale walls and paper stars, where a stack of baby clothes waited folded with the reverence of a new faith. On the dresser, a list of names, Anna, Maya, Pearl, leaned beneath a magnet shaped like a moon. He picked up the tiny hat she'd knitted while watching a show they both pretended to enjoy and pressed it to her sternum until the knit left an imprint. Linda said he'd done what a man must. He stared at the whiteboard where Sarah had doodled a crooked heart next to an appointment date, and an ache bloomed with a clarity that had nothing to do with money. If he was wrong, he had converted his marriage into evidence, his wife into a suspect, his child's near birth into a case number. He sat at the table and stacked the 200s, smoothing their edges with his thumb as though neatness could produce a third. Somewhere, the officers drove her to a place with fluorescent lights and questions that did not care about shared playlists or favorite pancakes or the ultrasound picture in his wallet. He did not cry, he did not sleep. He waited for the shape of certainty to feel like safety, and discovered, minute by
Michael woke to a house that sounded different without Sarah's small morning rituals. The kettle click, the low hum of her favorite podcast, the soft shuffle of slippers, and the absence scraped at him more effectively than any accusation could. He dialed the station before coffee cooled, gave his name, explained that his wife was 9 months pregnant, asked about bail, asked if they could pause whatever was happening, and the officer on the other end replied with the neutral firmness of process. She'd been booked, she would be held until initial appearance, statements were on file, and any retraction needed to be formal, notarized, and delivered in person. He wrote down the instructions with a pen that skipped, then found himself staring at the page as if the ink could make the situation less real. Linda stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, chin lifted like she was propping up his resolve with posture alone, and said that changing his mind now would make everything worse, that drawing a line mattered, that if Sarah was innocent, she would say so and come home with a new respect for boundaries. He nodded without agreeing. His stomach felt like he'd swallowed a stone. Every object in the house auditioned for relevance. A pair of burp cloths drying over the chair back, a prenatal vitamin bottle rattling half empty, the hospital bag by the door with travel-sized soaps and a folded robe, and the ordinariness mocked him. He tried to draft the retraction anyway and couldn't find a sentence that didn't sound like it was begging someone to undo the man he'd been last night. When Tom arrived mid-morning, he took one look at Michael's face and didn't bother with greetings, just asked for the story like a mechanic asking what noise a car makes. Hearing it out loud made the plot sound thinner, the motives meaner. Tom squinted at the timeline, then scanned the room the way people do when they're certain the thing you're missing is 3 inches from your hand. Money disappears in dumb ways, he said, knuckles grazing the couch seam, eyes flicking beneath the coffee table. You tore this place up? Michael bristled, then deflated. He searched, but his search had been sweaty and panicked, not thorough. He'd lifted cushions, but he hadn't listened for the small, stiff sound a bill makes when it's wedged in fabric. Linda cut in with a comment about enabling. Tom ignored her and started a methodical sweep, speaking softly as if to an animal. Checked jackets, laundry baskets, the junk drawer, the stack of unopened mail, yesterday's jeans by the hamper, the tote from the grocery run, the pockets of the coat you never use but actually used once last week. Michael followed, touched by the practical mercy of a list. They found receipts for something Michael didn't remember buying, then remembered, batteries and tape, late-night dash. So the math held. They found a crumpled shopping list with nipples written in Sarah's neat print, circled twice, and the word made him dizzy with tenderness and shame. He called the station again and asked if he could see Sarah, leave a message, send her supplements. The desk sergeant said there was a process for property drop-off and another for messages. And yes, he could write one that might be delivered. No guarantees. He wrote, "I'm sorry," 10 times and threw those drafts away. Then wrote, "I believe you," and kept it. When Emily's name flashed on his phone, he answered to the sound of anger braided with fear. She told him what the holding cell smelled like, told him Sarah had asked for quiet and a pillow, told him the family would take it from here, and then she hung up before he could say the words clogging his throat. The group thread with his friends lit up. "Is it true? What are you doing?" One sent a link to a think piece about financial gaslighting, a phrase that landed like a diagnosis even though he hadn't clicked it yet. He stepped outside and felt the way the block watched him, not openly hostile, exactly, but revised. People adjusted their mental files around you after you did something public, even if you wanted to file it under private shame. Back inside, Linda put a plate of toast in front of him and said he needed to keep his strength for whatever comes next. And he stared at the butter melting into the bread and thought about trust melting into suspicion, the way one seeps until everything is damp and you're surprised the floor warps. He sent the formal retraction to the station by email and printed copy, then drove it down himself despite Linda's protest. Sitting in a chair outside records for 40 minutes with a number card in his hand like a deli line, thinking about how institutions were built for people exactly like him, confident men who believed forms could fix hearts. He filed it anyway. Back home, the nursery pulled him like gravity. He stood by the crib and practiced introductions to a baby that wasn't there. "I'm your dad. I made a ruin, and I'm trying to make a road." On the whiteboard, he erased the word do and wrote do. Stupid little joke Sarah would have laughed at, and the loneliness of that unshared humor thumped through him. He texted Tom to thank him and got back a picture of a couch cushion half lifted with the caption, "Check seams like these," a nudge without blame. Evening arrived unceremoniously, TV murmuring from another room, the house hollowing around his footsteps, and he stood in the doorway holding his own stillness like a dangerous tool, trying to measure how much of this could be undone and how. Tom arrived again just after noon with a hardware store practicality that cut through Michael's looping thoughts. He set his keys down, rolled his sleeves, and said, "Let's start over, slow." Then walked the perimeter of the living room as if mapping a crime scene, hands skimming baseboards, eyes cataloging layers of daily life that panic had blurred. Michael followed, narrating the night the way you confess to yourself, pointing out where he'd stood, where Sarah had sat, how Linda had hovered, and hearing his own voice made the choice sound smaller and meaner than the drama he'd wrapped it in. Tom crouched at the sofa, pressed 2 fingers into the cushion seam, and listened with his fingertips. He explained how paper talks when it's trapped, stiffer than lint, softer than a coin, then pressed deeper until his nail caught the edge of something that crackled. "Hold up," he breathed, and worked the seam like the lip of a stubborn envelope until a green corner flashed. Michael froze. Tom pinched carefully and eased the bill free, the couch surrendering it with a whisper that felt louder than any verdict. There it was, crumpled but unmistakable, the missing 100, the hinge on which the last 48 hours had swung and crashed. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Tom's, "I must have dropped it the other day when I borrowed your wallet to run for washers, remember?" collided with Michael's hand coming up to his mouth, shame flooding him so completely he could taste metal. The room telescoped. The whiteboard with baby names, the hospital bag, the jar of pacifiers, each object suddenly an indictment of the man who had believed evidence lived only in his wallet. He didn't yell at Tom. The math of blame had been rewritten by the fact of the bill in his palm. He grabbed his keys with fingers that wouldn't steady and told Linda he was going to the station, and she started to say something about too late and lesson, but he was already at the door because the only lesson that mattered now was the one he had to offer on paper and in person. I was wrong. He drove in a silence that wasn't empty so much as packed,
apologies, ifs, a throb of disbelief in himself, parked badly, and hurried inside, the found bill folded tight in his fist as if he might be asked to prove his guilt. Records smelled like toner and impatience. A clerk slid a form toward him without judgment, as though men arrived here every day with different versions of the same sin. He wrote in big, rigid handwriting about the cushion seam in the discovery and Tom's admission and his own certainty that had been cosplaying as virtue, then initialed every page like the repetition might scour the stain. "Can I see her?" he asked, and the clerk's mouth made the sympathetic line that means no long before the word came. Sarah had been moved to processing for county transfer, and even if he stapled his remorse to the statement, even if he taped the bill to his chest, the machinery couldn't reverse until it finished doing exactly what he'd asked it to begin. "A message," he pressed, and the clerk nodded toward a small stack of forms half hidden behind a sign about appropriate conduct. Michael wrote, "I found it. You were right. I am sorry. I was wrong." The way you might write last words if you didn't know whether there would be a later to improve them. He asked a sergeant to carry the message back, and the man said he'd try, the way people say, "I'll pray for you," when they mean both the wish and the limits. In the lobby, Michael sat on a plastic chair and stared at the double doors that kept not opening, the found bill now smoothed flat on his knee, and tried to reorder memory so that the discovery had come first and the call had never been made. The mind, loyal even to our worst narratives, refused. Back home, Linda tried to stage a conversation about future boundaries and what you can salvage, but he walked past her into the nursery and let the room's softness punch him. The mobile of paper moons, the changing pad waiting like a stage for rituals of care, he'd forfeited. The stack of bedtime books Sarah had thrifted with quiet pride. He laid the 100 on the dresser and wrote "cost" on a sticky note and stuck it to the bill as if labeling the damage could keep it from spreading further. When Emily called, he answered on the first ring, words tumbling. "Found it. I was wrong. I'm so sorry. Tell her," until she cut in with a controlled anger that didn't need volume. "Michael, she's exhausted and scared and contracting on and off. They might move her if labor starts. Do not come to the hospital. Do not come to my house. Do not call again tonight." He said, "Please," and she said, "No," and then the line went dead. The kind of clean ending that makes you understand the mess you made is someone else's to clean. He texted Tom that the bill had become a confession, and Tom replied with a single sentence that held both apology and uselessness. "I'm sorry, man." Evening settled like a consequence. He tried to eat and couldn't, tried to sleep and couldn't, tried to draft a letter to Sarah that didn't center his pain, and finally managed one that didn't even mention the word forgive, only, "I will show up for our daughter the way I should have shown up for you." Before bed, he picked up the tiny kitted hat again and pressed it to his chest until he felt its texture mark his skin, as if he could trade bruises with the past and balance the ledger that way. The house breathed around him, indifferent, and he lay awake learning the exact weight of $100 when it's made of paper.
Michael arrived at the hospital with the panicked purpose of a man who thinks speed can outvote consequence, and met a front desk nurse whose kindness did not bend the rules. Yes, she knew who Sarah was. No, he couldn't go back. Yes, he could leave a note. No, she would not deliver it if Sarah said not to. And when he whispered, "Please tell her I found the money," the nurse wrote the sentence on a sticky note as if even words required triage. He took a seat in the waiting area where televisions murmured inoffensive weather and strangers scrolled their phones. And while contractions rose and fell somewhere behind double doors, he practiced a discipline he had never learned, being still without calling it defeat. Emily swept past him only once, a bag of fresh clothes in one hand, a glare that said custodianship in the other, and her mouth made the smallest shape of no before her body did, a semaphore he could read from a decade away. He stayed until his legs ached, until a volunteer with a clipboard suggested he get food, until the night shift lights flattened everything into hallway, and then he drove home to a house that felt like a witness that wouldn't testify. His phone was a courtroom, friends asking if it was true, a coworker suggesting he take a few weeks for the company's sake, a text from his boss that used words like optics and distraction. He answered none of them, set the device face down, and listened to the way silence had learned his address. In the morning, he called the station again and learned that procedural momentum was a river he could not swim upstream. Sarah had been transferred overnight before labor ramped, then sent back to the hospital when it did, and the officer's voice held that peculiar gentleness of people who see the same mistake daily and know how long it echoes. Linda, who had slept in the guest room and woken smaller, appeared in the kitchen doorway with an apology heavy enough to lean on. She had pressed, poisoned, pushed, thought she was protecting a son from being taken for granted, and instead helped him exchange trust for authority. He nodded because he didn't yet have a vocabulary for forgiving her without acquitting himself, and because everything sounded like a footnote to an event that would always be the headline. He packed a bag of things Sarah might want: lip balm, her robe, the baby blanket her grandmother crocheted, the list of pediatricians they'd circled, and drove it to the hospital entrance, where a security guard with forearms like statues explained drop-off procedures. He handed the bag over and stood there longer than made sense, just in case a clerk called his name or a door swung wide by accident. When the nurse eventually emerged with news that Sarah had asked for no visitors and no messages, he nodded as if she had just confirmed a scientific fact and walked to his car feeling the strange dignity of being denied what you have not earned. At home, he filled the day with penance disguised as order. He scrubbed countertops that were already clean, folded laundry by type and softness, sorted the stack of unpaid envelopes, and unsubscribed from nonsense emails, then sat in the nursery and read aloud to a crib that did not yet hold an audience, careful to give the cadence he would want Anna to remember. When his voice cracked, he started the page again. By afternoon, gossip had matured into reputation. At the grocery store, a cashier who had once asked about the due date now counted change without looking up. On the sidewalk, a neighbor who always over-explained his lawn care offered a tight nod and retreated. Online, a post with his name dared people to define gaslighting, and 100 strangers obliged. He closed the laptop and put it in a drawer like it could contaminate air. The therapist fit him in for an emergency session and asked questions that were more scaffolding than trap. What did control feel like in your body? What does repair look like if she never comes home? Where did you first learn to mistrust stillness? And he spoke until the shape of his own fear surprised him, a child hiding under a table, banging on its underside to feel important. Back on the couch that had eaten the bill, he wrote a letter addressed to whoever would be allowed to read it first: Sarah if she chose, Emily if she needed gatekeeping, his daughter someday if context mattered, and kept the tone narrow. No demands, no bargaining, only the admission that he had confused leadership with suspicion and masculinity with judgment. When evening came, the nurse called from a blocked number and said 4 words that split him open and stitched him shut at once. She delivered. A girl. He asked about health like a mantra and heard the answer he dared to hope for, both stable, and then the coda he expected: Sarah has declined your visit. And he said thank you, because gratitude that isn't conditional might be the first honest thing he'd offered in days. He whispered the baby's name options into the quiet and realized her actual name would be chosen without him, which felt exactly right and impossibly hard. He placed the found 100 in a jar on the dresser and wrote "cost" on a label, then sat in the dark and learned how to breathe around a truth that would not shrink with time. Some consequences arrive on paper, some in the eyes of a woman behind a glass window, and some in the way your house continues to hold the shape of the person you accused.
Mrs. Carter arrived 2 days later with a clipboard and a posture that suggested she had seen every permutation of regret and wasn't there to litigate it so much as to measure what might be built on its far side. She walked the rooms with quiet competence, pausing at the whiteboard of baby names, the jar on the dresser labeled "cost" with the single flattened bill inside, the hospital bag Sarah had packed that he couldn't bring himself to unpack. And she asked questions that sounded simple and landed heavy. Who is allowed keys now? What boundaries exist between you and your mother? What will you do if Sarah says no to anything you want? And Michael answered without decorating the facts, telling her about the retraction, the letter he'd sent through Emily, the emergency therapy session, the way the house had taught him another definition of silence. She explained the process like a bridge you crawl, not sprint. Intake, assessment, recommendations, the possibility of supervised visitation if and when Sarah consents, and the firm condition that respect for Sarah's boundaries would be treated as the first test of fitness. He nodded and signed forms with the humility of someone who understands signatures are receipts, not redemption. His boss called to formalize unpaid leave, and the word optics floated between them like a bad fluorescent light. Michael agreed quickly because arguing felt like relapsing into the reflex that had built this mess. Linda came by at dusk, smaller around the eyes, and offered an apology that unspooled without self-defense. She had confused love with control, protection with suspicion, motherhood with a kind of gatekeeping that had calcified into a habit. He listened and said he forgave her, not as absolution, but as a choice not to multiply damage. Then told her there would be no more conversations about Sarah in tones of certainty, and no visits without asking first. She nodded, chastened but relieved by something that looked like a boundary and felt like oxygen. When Emily finally texted a single line, "You may see Anna Friday at the community center, 20 minutes, supervised," he sat on the floor of the nursery and cried into the little star-patterned blanket he'd folded and refolded, the smallest permission arriving like a door cracked in a storm. Friday came, and the room they gave him smelled like disinfectant and crayons. A folding table held a box of plastic toys and a timer, and the wall poster said, "Be kind," and letters clearly designed for disputes that hadn't yet ruined mortgages and last names. Emily entered with a carrier and a stance that said she could end this at any point. Inside, Anna blinked up with the astonishing indifference of the newly born, fists curled, lashes dark against cheeks that looked like they were storing summer. Michael asked if he could hold her, and did so the way you receive a sacrament, with attention, with both hands, with a mouth that forgets words. His chest discovered a new rhythm under her weight. He said nothing about the 100, nothing about the station, nothing about the way his knights had learned to keep breathing around knives. He said only, "Hi, I'm your dad," and then told her the story of her own fingers as they flexed against his thumb. The timer shaved minutes off his awe. Emily watched from a chair with arms folded, and when Anna fussed, he returned her quickly, not as surrender, but as consent to a new order in which he was not the decider. After, in the parking lot, he handed Emily an envelope for Sarah that contained the narrowest kind of letter. No argument, no bargain, just the sentence he would be willing to be held to. "I will show up for our daughter exactly as you ask, for as long as it takes." He went home and made lists not of shortcuts, but of stabilities. Therapy Thursdays, volunteering Saturdays, a men's group on Tuesdays where he would be the one to say the unslick thing, "I mistook suspicion for leadership," and sit there as other men ran out of excuses. He called the bank to set up automatic transfers for child support, texted Tom back when Tom sent another apology that couldn't touch the center of anything, and pried up each loose board in his life that had made room for certainty to masquerade as care. That night he read to the empty crib again, pacing the cadence he wanted Anna to remember, and when the walls did not echo, he counted the non-echo as progress, because repair, he was learning, sounded less like yes and more like not yet. It looked like showing up to a room that smelled like crayons and keeping your hands open. It felt like letting the timer ring without panicking. It lived in the discipline of never telling your own version first.
Michael built a scaffolding of small, repeatable acts because anything grand felt like a shortcut back to the man who had made the call. Therapy on Thursdays, where he learned to answer questions with nouns instead of defenses. A men's group on Tuesdays, where he said the unfancy sentence, "I confused leadership with suspicion," and then sat in the heat of it without reaching for humor or blame. Volunteer shifts on Saturdays, stacking boxes at the community center, whose supervised room still smelled like disinfectant and crayons. He set automatic transfers for child support, not as leverage, but as floor, took unpaid leave without argument when HR said optics,
and stopped narrating to anyone who wasn't directly harmed, letting the story shrink to its workable size. The visits with Anna became a metronome for his week. 20 minutes became 30 when Emily saw that he could soothe an infant without making it an audition. He learned her startle reflex, the way her breathing settled against his chest, the soft grunt before a nap that meant he should walk, not bounce. He brought one book each time and never insisted on finishing it, memorizing instead how her fist opened like a starfish around his finger. Boundaries, once weapons, became furniture, visible, solid, useful. He told Linda she could visit only with notice and never to discuss Sarah except to ask what help was needed. And when Linda stood in the doorway with a pie she'd baked and an apology she'd practiced, he thanked her, set the pie down, and held the line without drama, discovering that gentleness and firmness were not rivals but twins who had been separated at birth. The neighborhood acclimated to the new weather. A neighbor who used to over-explain his lawn now gave a brief nod that said, in effect, "Work on yourself is contagious." Another pressed a flyer for a dad's playgroup into Michael's palm without comment. At the grocery store, a cashier who had gone silent during the scandal said, "How's the baby?" like an invitation to act normal. And he answered, "She's thriving," adding nothing, demanding nothing. Online, the posts calling him a monster accumulated comments and dust. He stopped checking after the therapist asked, "What data are you feeding, shame or change?" And he realized one grew when he scrolled and the other grew when he folded laundry. Nights he read aloud to the empty crib, breaking the old habit of performing contrition by practicing presence instead. He spoke as if Anna were there, because she would be, sometimes, and because the cadence of a father's voice should not be an inheritance tied to the whim of forgiveness. On a humid afternoon, Mrs. Carter returned to assess consistency, which she defined as boring goodness, and he surprised himself by smiling. She asked practical questions. Had he attended every visit? Had there been any unapproved contact? Had he complied with the schedule? And he answered yes, no, yes, then showed her the calendar where he blocked time for quiet as if it were an appointment with a specialist. When Emily texted that Sarah did not want updates from him but appreciated reliability, he screenshotted the schedule, sent it to Emily only, and put the phone down before the reflex to explain could wake up. Work offered a partial return, doing tasks nobody fought over, back-end reports, early morning inventory checks, and he took it gratefully, discovering that humility turns fluorescent light into something like dawn if you stop rating yourself. He began speaking once a month at a small church basement to a circle of men who had other versions of the same bruise. He did not varnish or widen the story, would not say the word lesson because he learned how often it conceals punishment, and kept to the plain truth. I accused the person I loved most because a story in my head felt safer than a question in my mouth. After the meeting, one man cried in the parking lot and texted his wife apologies. Another scoffed and didn't return. Michael learned to let both outcomes belong to time. On an evening when the light made the nursery walls look warmer than they were, he opened the jar on the dresser, took out the flattened bill, and wrote "cost" on a new label in smaller letters. Then beside it added another label, work, because he had discovered that the number was not the measurement and the jar was not the fix, only a reminder not to touch old fire with new hands. He watered the sapling Linda had planted in his yard, a mutual apology turned living thing, without letting himself narrate metaphors to the branches. Growth, he was learning, didn't need witnesses, only consistency and weather. When the community center timer chimed at the next visit and Anna stirred, he handed her back quickly, and Emily watched him with a gaze that had shifted a degree toward open. He didn't seize the inch as proof of a mile. Walking to his car afterward, he felt the smallest change inside him, not triumph, but traction. The sense that he was no longer performing repair for absolution, but practicing it, because it was the only way to be the man his daughter would memorize.
On Anna's first birthday, Michael left a small wrapped book and a stuffed star on Sarah's porch before sunrise, added a short note, "For Anna, from the quiet side of the street," and walked away without waiting for the door to open, discovering that restraint could feel like a gift too. Later that morning, Emily texted,
Park on Saturday, 30 minutes, I'll be nearby. And the sentence felt like a window unlatching. Saturday arrived at a modest playground where swings squeaked and parents negotiated snack times like diplomats. Michael stood by the low blue slide with a thermos of water, sunscreen, wipes, and the conscious decision to be useful without performing it. Sarah appeared with Anna on her hip, the baby in a yellow sweater that made her eyes look like late summer. She set Anna down and stayed standing, one hand on the stroller, the other tucked into her coat pocket, a posture that announced both presence and perimeter. He said hello and nothing else. The not else mattered, proving to both of them that he could share a space without colonizing it. Anna tottered leaf to leaf, narrating discoveries with the one-syllable exuberance of the nearly one, and he knelt to receive the rock she deemed treasure, then handed it back as if the handoff were ceremony. When Sarah spoke, it was administrative. Snack times, nap windows, a brief mention of a pediatrician's advice about shoes, and he answered in the same register, learning the modest relief of a conversation with no subtext. A gust lifted the corner of Anna's hat, and he adjusted it gently, then stepped back, letting Sarah see that his hands understood the new choreography. Emily watched from a bench, vigilant but not barbed, and after 20 minutes she relaxed a fraction. Michael didn't celebrate the fraction, just matched it with his own. When Anna fell and looked up with the quick inhale that precedes a wail, both adults leaned in and then paused, waiting for her to choose whose shoulder. She toddled to Sarah, cried into her sweater, and Michael stayed near without crowding, repeating, "You're okay," to the air in a tone aimed at the part of himself that still believed comfort needed credit. After, they walked a slow loop by the low fence while Anna, revived, dragged a stick through dust, writing a script only she could read. Sarah said, without preface, "I don't forgive you because you earned it, but because she deserves a father who learned." And the sentence landed like a plumb line, true down to bedrock. He nodded once and replied, "I will not ask you to manage my remorse," a promise he could actually keep. Over the next weeks, park visits became a cadence, Tuesdays with short clouds, Saturdays with longer light. Sometimes Emily came, sometimes she didn't. Sometimes Sarah set a blanket and scribbled in a notebook while he stacked blocks with Anna. Once, when a bee wandered close, he reminded himself that flinching toward rescue can be a kind of theft if it overrides the person who is already protecting. Mrs. Carter called these low-stakes reps and expanded them by 10 minutes after each uneventful week, praising boring goodness like it was a badge. Linda, practicing her own humility, texted Sarah separately to ask whether she might meet Anna at a public library story hour. Sarah agreed with conditions, no advice disguised as affection, no talk of the past. And Linda said yes, then kept the agreement, surprising herself by how much easier love felt without the weight of opinion. At work, Michael took dawn shifts and spreadsheets, the sorts of tasks that leave room for evening parks. He stopped measuring progress by whether neighbors waved and started measuring it by whether he could leave a visit without replaying it for hours as self-critique. One afternoon, after a rain that had already dried into the grass, Sarah told him she'd be 5 minutes late, and he waited without texting, "Are you close?" A small victory against the old impulse to push. She arrived with a kite shaped like a swallow, and he held the spool while Anna laughed at the wind's invisible hands. When the string tugged, he passed it to Sarah, who passed it back, a wordless relay that felt like trust practicing in public. Near the end of the month, Sarah handed him a printed schedule, 2 park afternoons, 1 supervised community center visit, a note about RSV season, and he read it like an invitation to competency. "If you keep this, we can talk about an hour." And he answered only, "I will keep it," then put the paper in his wallet alongside the ultrasound photo he still carried, the one that had once sat next to a folded 100 and now lived beside a list of boundaries written in his own hand. Walking back to his car with the kite string imprint faint on his fingers, he felt something unfamiliar and unspectacular, traction, not triumph, the quiet knowledge that he was not chasing a dramatic absolution anymore, just laying down, visit by visit, the planks of a road his daughter could walk without tripping on his pride.
By late autumn, the rhythm that had once felt like punishment began to feel like a life. Calendars shared through Emily, park afternoons that stretched to an hour with no incidents, a community center slot kept as a guardrail rather than a sentence. And Michael learned to treat each ordinary success as sufficient, not as a down payment on some cinematic reunion.
On a Tuesday lit the color of unpolished copper, Sarah arrived with Anna in a denim jacket dotted with tiny stars and said, matter of fact, that they could try alternating Saturdays, one with her, one with Emily, so Anna could see him outside the same two locations. And he said thank you in the same register, resisting the urge to gild it. The men's group started asking him to speak last because he no longer reached for dramatic finishes. He told them the unadorned version. He made a call, he found a bill, he discovered process is slower than regret, and left the room to its own conclusions. At work, he took the early shift inventory that nobody wanted, finding a private steadiness in counting what was actually there instead of what he believed should be. At home, he replaced the COST label on the jar with two new ones, work and warning, and stopped opening it except to remind himself that symbols are only useful if they make you behave better in the unfilmed minutes. Linda, careful and contrite, asked for boundaries in writing and kept to them. Once at a library story hour, she sat 2 rows back, letting Anna's attention anchor to Sarah and Michael rather than to a grandmother's corrective murmur, and afterward she handed Sarah a bag of board books with a note that said only, "For her, with gratitude that you set the rules." The supervised room at the community center began to seem less like surveillance and more like neutral ground where habits could practice becoming character. Mrs. Carter, reading off a checklist, praised boring reliability and proposed a probationary phase of unsupervised half-afternoons in public spaces with clear start and end times. He bought a cheap watch and made a ceremony of punctuality. On a pale Saturday, Sarah handed him a laminated card that outlined expectations and contingencies, snacks, nap cues, a list of numbers, and he took it the way some men take oaths, repeating its contents back until she nodded, then buckling Anna into her car seat with the reverence of someone fastening on his own second chance. They went nowhere flashy, a duck pond that smelled faintly of algae and bread, a thrift store where he let her choose a picture book with a dog on every page, a diner where the waitress slid him a second napkin without commentary when applesauce escaped containment. He sent one photo to Emily, Anna in a paper hat, grin glazed with apples, and nothing else, withholding the narrative so the facts could stand alone. Returning on time, he described the afternoon in bullet points, not flourishes, and watched Sarah receive information without bracing. "Same time next week," she said, and the quiet of that sentence felt like a door he could be trusted to close gently. Winter approached with its particular demands, coats that take too long to wrangle, colds that arrive without RSVP, schedules that shrink daylight, and he adapted without petition, canceling when Anna coughed, rescheduling without sulking, discovering that love proved itself most in how you behaved around inconvenience. On a night when the tree in his yard held more sky than leaves, he stood on the porch with the jar in one hand and the tiny hat in the other, and understood that penance had given way to practice. He no longer needed to feel bad to do right. In February, at a check-in meeting, Mrs. Carter looked over her glasses and said the word that had once sounded like fantasy and now sounded like logistics, unsupervised, with the addendum, "Review in 90 days." And he wrote the dates on his calendar as if they were ordinary, because for once, that was the point. At the park after, Sarah thanked him, 2 syllables, unembellished, for never arguing about boundaries and never asking for a faster path. He replied that he had stopped grading days and started stacking them, and she allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind that doesn't promise anything, except that the conversation is not over. Anna, who now ran like a rumor gaining speed, tugged his sleeve and demanded the duck story again. He told it for the 10th time with the same patient cadence, and when she interrupted to correct the number of ducks, he laughed and accepted the edit. Walking back to separate cars, Sarah said, "This is for her," and he said, "I know," and neither of them tried to turn it into more. That night, he spoke to the men's group about questions that keep a house intact. Did I check the couch seam?
did I check my pride, and drove home under a sky that was simply dark, not metaphorical, and felt something like relief. Not that he had been forgiven into the past, but that he had been admitted into the work of a future where his daughter would remember him as a man who kept his word when no one was watching.